We all have these stories that we loved hearing as children. Some get told stories about witches, others hear about Bigfoot or haunted houses. Ghost stories are also extremely popular. I mean, not only among children, but among folks in general. Well, when I was younger, I used to be a Boy Scout, so it was normal for me to spend weekends away from home without missing my parents and siblings. Heck, I joined the Cub Scouts since I was 5 years old, so I was pretty used to being independent. And being a Boy Scout, it's very interesting. I would say it's way more interesting than people think. It's not just a group of kids learning things. It's an overall group of friends having fun. My friends and I always had an absolute blast whenever we had Boy Scout reunions, and without a doubt, the thing that we enjoyed the most was when we had to spend the night away from home, either in the Boy Scout cabin site or when we went camping. Whenever we had a Boy Scout sleepover, it was great, particularly when the night came. Not to paint the stereotypical American picture, but whenever it got dark, all of us kids sat with our mentors or whoever it was in charge around a bonfire, eating s'mores or other delicious things while we spoke about different things. And among the most popular topics, of course, was horror stories. Campfire stories, ghost stories. Like, it's usual, everybody had a story to tell, but without a doubt, some of the most interesting stories were stories that we could relate to. I mean, sure, vampires in Transylvania or the ghost of your dear great-grandma in Oklahoma makes a good story, but the stories we really liked, the ones that really gave us goosebumps and woke our curiosities, were the stories that we could relate to. So, pretty much anything that happened in the woods. Now, having a large group of kids and fun adults in the woods, you're going to hear some very interesting stories. But there was one that was extremely popular. One story that was a classic. The one that you would always hear, yet you don't get tired of. Story of a swamp monster. Yeah, a swamp monster. A rather underground, creepy story. And perhaps not as intimidating as a demon or as thrilling as a serial killer, but it was a story in some sort of way that really hit home. And why? Well, because he roams around the woods, the place that we so often frequent. And what's spookier than hearing that a monster lives close to where you are? Hearing that a monster has attacked one of you before. That's right. The ever so popular Winston Barry. Now, Winston Barry was a normal kid who, like many other kids around town, was a Boy Scout. An exceptional one, actually. Winston was friends with a lot of other kids. For better context, Winston was a Boy Scout in the 40s, and was, in fact, a real person who many of the other kids' grandparents knew. Also, there were pictures of Winston around the camp, including in memory of him with a poem dedicated to him after his death. One day, as it's normal, the kids were exploring around the woods. However, this particular day, they went further than normal. They headed to an area known for its swamp. Being in the 1940s, things were different back then. In the words of many grandpas, people were not such snowflakes, especially kids. So they were not afraid whatsoever of exploring there. As they were exploring around, it began to rain, and moving around the swamp became very uncomfortable, so the kids decided to head back to find their mentor. Except for Winston, who wanted to continue. The kids then started to head back as Winston kept walking opposite from them. And after a few minutes of walking, they could no longer see each other, but all of a sudden, the kids heard a scream coming from behind them. They immediately recognized the voice. They knew it was Winston. The kids immediately ran toward their friend as fast as they could, trying to guide themselves by hearing his desperate, blood-curdling wails. But unfortunately, once they got there, it was too late. Winston was dead. But his unresponsive corpse was not all they found. they noticed a strange figure running away from them. Unfortunately, due to the rain and their desperation, none of the kids could really make out what the figure was, but they all described it equally. A green, mushy, and smelly figure that looked big and dense. It did not move fast, neither slow, but it seemed to disappear into the dark, muddy water. They are sure that the creature was responsible of what happened to Winston. Help came a few minutes later, but there was nothing else anybody could do. And the kids told the adults what they saw. One of the kids, who was a bookworm, said that the creature they had seen was a monster, the swamp monster to be exact. And all the other kids believed his theory. But of course, the adults didn't. People concluded it had been an animal, since it was green, more than likely an alligator, and that's how adults closed the case. But the kids didn't let it go. They spread the information about the swamp monster as quick as a flash, and years later the story of Winston Barry and the swamp monster was still relevant. Another thing is that Winston was not the only victim of the swamp monster. There was another Boy Scout a few years after Winston, who got lost in the woods and never reappeared, and a random woman who was new in the town had the same fate. But it is said that the days when those things happened were rainy days, which started a theory that rain wakes up the swamp monster. Now, there was one summer break that me and a whole bunch of Boy Scouts were staying at the summer camp. And I remember I was 9 years old back when this happened. Everything seemed normal, but there was this one day that it started to rain, so we got told to stay indoors doing some wood carving. And that particular summer day was very foggy and cold, so some of us actually went to our rooms to be more comfortable under the blankets, and of course, telling horror stories. Since it was almost the end of the day, our mentor let us do it. Back in the cabins, a big group of us gathered. In my room there were 6 of us. Me, my friends, Michael, Austin, Ezra, and brothers Saul and Reuben. My friends and I had this love-hate relationship with the other 3. They were such little smugs who thought highly of themselves, yet still hung out with them at times. Since it was raining, it was only natural that the story of the swamp monster was brought up. Michael, Saul, and Reuben were not the most courageous, so you could tell they were scared by the story. But Austin was just like me and Ezra. He pretended he was not afraid of anything. Ezra was, my nemesis. We tended to be very competitive with each other, so if I was not afraid, he was not afraid either. Although, in all honesty, none of us was 100% brave, but as long as we pretended. During our conversation, Ezra came up with an idea. He said we should all go into the woods near the swamp to see if these rumors about the swamp monster were real. At the beginning, we were all hesitant about it because we didn't want to get in trouble, but at the end, Ezra came up with a plan. We'll go there during the first hours of the morning, at around 4 in the morning, if it was still raining. We chose 4 a.m. because from 3 a.m. to 7:30 a.m., the mentors don't tend to check on us all that much. Michael immediately refused because he didn't want to get into trouble, and that was fine because we needed someone to cover us just in case. Saul and Reuben were not so keen about it either, but we needed at least one of them because they had been taken there by their older brother before. So at the end, Reuben decided to join us. Once we decided to go to bed, there's a very quiet atmosphere, even though none of us were sleeping. The truth is, we all felt anxious, but we're too proud to speak about it. And I, for example, stayed awake the whole night paying attention to the sound of rain, hoping that it would eventually cease. But it never did. And so at 4 a.m., Ezra, Reuben, Austin, and I departed. It was still rather dark, but thanks to our flashlights, we could still see. This was not our first time exploring the dark. We were trained for this, so adventuring into the depths of the woods was no problem whatsoever. The whole trip to the swamp consisted of Ezra and me mocking each other, and Reuben and Austin being rather quiet. And as we were approaching our destination, and the swamp was already visible, we heard a noise coming from there. It sounded like an old man growling. That, and the putrid smell around, made Reuben throw his flashlight to the ground, and he said that we needed to go back. But Ezra said that we were too close to give up now. Now I know it sounds cocky, but we were also carrying our carving knives and other things, so we felt safe. Now Austin, on the other hand, agreed with Reuben and said that he would go back. Ezra teased him about it. "You don't really think this monster exists, do you?" he asked. "I don't know if the monster exists, but there's clearly an animal over there and I'm not going to risk my life," he said and left with Reuben. Looking back at it, I wish Ezra and I would have been as smart as them. When the other two left, Ezra immediately began to be more competitive. "So, who's going to go there first?" he said before he took off running, and I in that moment felt more adrenaline than fear, and so I ran after him, trying to be faster. And there we were, running, letting our ignorance get the best of us without even acknowledging how dangerous it was for a couple of 9-year-olds to be running wild in such a place at 5 in the morning. And all of a sudden, I tripped over something hard and fell over. Ezra immediately began to laugh hysterically. I was not too happy anymore, and not just because falling over hurt, but because I tripped against something hard as a rock that suddenly disappeared the moment I fell. "I think there's something here," I said to Ezra. "Oh, what? You gonna start with the same as the others? Come on, Flander. I thought you were better than that," Ezra replied. "I'm not lying, there's something here. Maybe an animal. I think we should go back," I told him. "No, we're here to catch this monster. Do you remember?" he interrupted me. At that moment, as I was still in the swampy water, I saw something moving around in circles. "Ezra, do you see that?" I asked while I was pointing at this thing. But at the exact moment Ezra was going to look at it, something emerged from the water. I knew what this thing was. For I had heard this story so many times. It was the swamp monster. I couldn't believe how accurate to the description of the story of Winston Barry he was. I was in shock for a few seconds. The creature was completely standing on his 2 feet and started to slowly approach me. I felt that I couldn't move. I even peed my pants. I thought it was the end, until Ezra did something stupid. He started throwing rocks at the monster while laughing. I don't know why he did it. I don't think his intention was to save me, but once again, Ezra wasn't brilliant, and he never thought. Everything was a game for him. This creature changed directions and started to go after Ezra, whose tanned face turned pale in a matter of seconds as he saw this abominable 7-foot creature coming at him. In a matter of seconds, this creature with leaves, mud, and sticks attached to his body completely covered my view of Ezra. But then I started hearing Ezra screaming in fear. I understood something. I would not survive unless I moved. So I stood up and ran away to where I came from. I didn't even bother to look back or to think whether I was being followed by this monster. I didn't think of Ezra either. All of my attention was focused on escaping. A few minutes into running, I luckily encountered Reuben and Austin, who were on their way back to the cabin site. They asked me what was wrong, but all I told them was to run, and they asked me where Ezra was, and all I could say was that Ezra was gone. And so, the 3 of us eventually got to the cabin site where we saw a crowd, including some of the mentors, the director, Saul, and Michael. I quickly told them what was going on, and most of the adults ran to look for Ezra, while the rest of us kids were taken inside the lunch area with some mentors and waited for the police to come. I was being asked what had happened, So I told them what I saw. A couple of minutes later, one of the mentors asked to speak to me in private and told me that he knew I was afraid and going through a lot, but to please stop telling my story because it's freaking the other kids out. He also starts implying that what I saw is not a monster, but rather a large, wild animal. Eventually, the police came and I told them my story, but they didn't believe it. They thought it was a wild animal too. And later on that day, we were taken to our houses, and an extensive search from the police and the adults in town began. And the purpose, looking for Ezra, of course. Unfortunately, all they could find of him was his shoe and his flashlight. No other traces. And immediately there was a theory that Ezra was eaten by a wild animal. None of the adults in the town believed my real story. Not even my parents. Only the kids, and with time, as they grew up, they also stopped believing this. And of course, I was always treated as the traumatized kid. The scouts were closed for a little while after that, but after 3 months they started running their activities again. They also put a memorial for Ezra. And I never came back, even though my therapist always encouraged me to get back out there. And the rest of my years I lived in constant fear. I felt guilty for not helping Ezra. I felt ashamed people didn't believe me about the monster, and I felt unsafe living in a town so close to the swamp. So as soon as I was 17 years old and I finished school, I moved to another town. And despite nobody in person believing the story, well, I hope everybody that listened does. I know he's out there. Probably closer than you think. And I saw it. And I'm sure others have as well.